Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and I'd like to address a few of the themes that we will be covering in the section on religion and terrorism. First, I think it's important to recognize that we have seen terrorism and violence in the major religious groups. With that said, it should also be noted that a vast majority of those in those religious groups are not violent and do not engage in terrorism. So we run into the problem, of course, of finding out how to assess risk and how to understand what we should be looking for in terms of counterterrorism. And we have some clues with some of the research, and I think what I've purposely done is gone ahead and moved more toward what we would see extreme reactions and behaviors and ideas from numerous religious groups. And your author does an excellent job in the chapter of covering that. Well, probably, and I'll mention a few resources. This is probably, for me, this is just an amazing reference source. The Oxford Handbook of Religion and Violence, Juergensmeyer, Kitts, and Jerison. They're the editors of this, and we have, let's see, we have 40 chapters, and they cover the overview of religious traditions and how that is related to violence. The major religious groups are represented there, and then also patterns and themes, looking at evil, human sacrifice, starvation and self-mutilation, apocalyptic religion and violence, cosmic war, just war, torture, sacred ground conflicts, and then also looking at analytic approaches from sociology, anthropology, psychology, political science, literary perspectives, and theological. And then a whole section on new directions, which is very relevant as well. Great reference source. I also found useful in studying religion and terrorism and violence, Kimball's two books. Charles Kimball, When Religion Becomes Evil, 5 Warning Signs, and later on, When Religion Becomes Lethal, both of these books. And Kimball points out, what we'll find is that a lot of these readings that focus on religion and terrorism talk about stages or a process of a small group that has those characteristics of that religious group that kind of break off and go in their own direction and form their own ideas. And for example, Professor Kimball talks about in When Religion Becomes Evil, 5 warning signs of corruption in religion. 1, absolute truth claims. 2, blind obedience. 3, establishing the ideal time, the end of times. 4, the end justifies any means. And 5, declaring a holy war. So Professor Kimball talks about that. It goes into detail in both his books. Another really helpful book I found was Neil Kressel's Bad Faith, the same author of Mass Hate, which I used in my genocide course a while back. But Mass Hate, The Dangers of Religious Extremism. Oops. And some of the features of that book focuses again on looking at characteristics, such as the group believing the world has gone awry, and then certainty of the particular religious view, an unwillingness to compromise, and also denouncing others and focusing on life and death. So characteristics that we begin to see emerging. The next book I wanted to mention, Mark Juergensmeyer, Terror in the Mind of God. You know, you've been working in the field a while when you have several editions of the same book. I have the third and the fourth edition here. What I've done with Dr. Juergensmeyer is I've linked in our announcements to a YouTube video, a presentation that he did that's about an hour long, that I think really covers a lot of the material that I would like to cover, and he does a much better job of it and goes into great detail. So I was linked to that, and you can view that when you can. But he talks about, I see it as he takes more of a dramaturgical approach, and that, of course, works very well with the symbolic interactionist theory that I've mentioned before. But he looks at the theater of terror and the concept of performance violence, looking at the symbolic aspects of the behavior to reach particular goals, and how terrorists and terrorist groups really are looking toward an audience to get a particular reaction. And in addition, there's a fight, a cosmic war, if you will, where there's a script that's generated for the group of good versus evil, and a struggle really, which becomes one against death. And so Juergensmeyer talks about different areas related to where danger or there's risks of violence in religious groups, and again, what he points out similar in many ways to what we see with Kimball and what we see with Kressel. But he has 4 stages: the world gone awry, foreclosing any options. So there's no negotiations really, or compromises. And then the Satanization and the cosmic war. So we see a group, or groups are painted as the enemy, as pure evil, and then symbolic acts of power. And he also has a chapter on warriors' power, where he talks about empowering marginal men. And there we get into areas of further study, which would include, for example, masculinity, threats, and seeing oneself as a soldier in a fight over the life of their group. And then I also have an article, Professor Seya's article, Confronting Apocalyptic Terrorism, Lessons from France and Japan. This was published recently in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism this year in 2020. Volume 43, issue 9, pages 775 to 795. And this article, I think, is an excellent example of a comparative analysis. That this really is just, I think, very helpful. And it's also one that addresses counterterrorism. So there's a lot going on in this article. Addresses religious extremism and terrorists. It provides a comparative analysis, a theoretical approach. And what you have here basically is comparing and contrasting ISIS in France and then we have Shinriko in Japan. And so we have that very helpful comparative analysis. And then I brought in another article because I wanted to also address children and terrorism. And I brought in an article by Kelly, Branham, and Decker in Conflict and Health. And the article is titled Abducted Children and Youth in Lord's Resistance Army in Northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Mechanisms of subordination and control. So here, how children become socialized into the Lord's Resistance Army, which was basically defined as a terrorist group by the United States government a while back. And so this is where we get into the other areas. Now, we already had some readings on that when we looked at Professor Kaplan's article. When we took a look at that article earlier, and Professor Kaplan article, The Fifth Wave, the New Tribalism. If you remember when we studied that particular article earlier, we looked at what this fifth wave would be, and he compared, or he started looking at and comparing Pol Pot in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, and then also the Lord's Resistance Army, and so we have that. So the interesting feature here is you have this apocalyptic terrorist scenario in these four groups, and so you can go back and look at that as well, and then you have basically a very useful comparison with several groups, and so that's very relevant. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of books and articles about child soldiers and the socialization process, socializing to become violent and aggressive and kill, and then resocialization when they're removed from that environment, and some of the strategies and techniques in assisting these victims. So there's some very interesting autobiographies written by former child soldiers. UCF hosted a former child soldier, just did an amazing presentation. There's a couple books out, amazing stuff. Very sad as well, very sad. We're always thinking, how can we prevent this from occurring in the first place? Another area that